Thank you. I want to thank the presenters for giving those great talks. And I think this is a really exciting time for therapeutics for this devastating disease that really has no FDA-approved options. And it's really telling that we have so many different types of therapies and different mechanisms, and all of this will continue to drive innovation for retina. So I'm joined here by this panel of experts, and I can't go through all their achievements because it would take all of our time. But what I can say is everyone here is multi-talented. We have clinicians, researchers, industry leaders, and we have creative thinkers and entrepreneurs up here with me. So thank you for coming. And I'm going to start by asking the questions that so many people, I'm sure, want to know. We'll start with our two clinicians, Dr. Hassan and Dr. Boyer. But this question's for you, Dr. Boyer. What do you think about incorporating some of these therapies for geographic atrophy into our clinical practice? Right now, I know you're so busy. I know how many up in the almost 100 patients you can see during a day, and you are busy injecting patients. And two of our phase 3 agents require potentially monthly or every other month treatment. How are you going to fit that into your day?
Well, I think retinal surgeons in general have been able to adapt to whatever is thrown our way. We had the same question asked to us when we had originally neovascular AMD, and then we added diabetes, and then we added vein occlusions, and we were able to adapt. I think in this case, we're going to have to streamline what we do. Basically, we do not need to get photographs at various time points. This is fairly straightforward. I probably won't dilate patients, but may get an OCT only because of the possibility of developing wet AMD or exudative changes with these patients. But we want to make it as quick as possible for these patients because these are working people. Some of them, have to go back to work. Also, a lot of the patients that we see that we really want to treat are asymptomatic. They come in with excellent visual acuity, and those are the ones that may be able to benefit the most from both the Apellis and Iveric data that was showing the extrafoveal lesions are really the ones you want to treat. The ones that want to be treated are the subfoveal who feel they're losing vision on a daily or monthly basis. How much they improve, I don't know.
Well, you brought up a good point, actually, I just want to continue on with, about imaging. So do you think that in these patients that you'll be using autofluorescence to follow them or OCT? How will you know if it's working?
I don't think that we'll be able to tell using autofluorescence. I don't think that's necessary. You may want to do it at baseline. You may want to do it yearly just to show the patients, what you're accomplishing. But I think OCT gives you the ability to, number one, be able to measure very accurately what's going on. It also, to me, is a better way of knowing if it's subfoveal lesions. A lot of this will depend on the labeling the FDA gives these two companies. If they give them the ability to treat all GA patients, that's one thing. But if they give it extrafoveal alone, that's another, model. But I think that originally I thought, well, we don't need OCT, but with the exudation that can occur with this, I think you'll have to do OCTs periodically, if not every time, to pick up that early exudation.
So you brought up an important point that exudation has been described in some of the phase 3 studies that have been evaluated, and it seems to be related to the frequency of dose. Dr. Hassan, two questions. How do you think that clinicians, do you think this will scare clinicians from using some of these agents because they don't want to have to deal with the exudation? And how are you going to keep patients in the game when you tell them about this potential complication?
Well, those are excellent questions and really what's on really everybody's mind as far as how we're going to deal with it. I think that to be truthful, and I'm sorry to my friends that work in the space, but this will scare clinicians. It'll scare a lot of them. You have your classic curve of early adopters, and then those that wait to see what happens, and then those that may not adopt in the long run. And I do think that there will be a pause while some watch what happens to other people as they treat their patients. I think, as Dave alluded to, the indications that we get to treat will be very important. If we're able to treat folks that have active wet CNV, we will get experience using these drugs for controlling the GA in concert with anti-VEGF therapy, that maybe the efficacy that we've all seen with anti-VEGF agents over the last 15 years will comfort us enough to allow us to feel that we can take on that risk, that, you know what, if there is a little bit of new exudation that develops, we've got the treatments for it and they're working. So I think, we learn as we do, and I think that that'll be the biggest thing is time. And then I think the further development of our imaging techniques, OCT, whether, we could be doing other artificial intelligence algorithms. Our software will hopefully improve it so that we can understand these sorts of changes better than in really the best of worlds, comfort us so that we don't worry as much about that amount of exudation.
So what do you think the ideal scenario is going to be when a patient comes in that you're treating for GA and they get exudation? You're going to say, I'm going to give you 2 injections today, I'm going to give you 1 injection today, another injection in 2 weeks. How do you think that is sustainable?
By our current working model, no, it really isn't. But as David alluded to, we are very adaptable. And I think we've figured out basically how to deal with every challenge put before us clinically, surgically, and otherwise. And I think we will. I think we will change our protocols. We will use home monitoring more. We will use wide field imaging more. We will do undilated exams. We may have injection clinics. God forbid if it got too overwhelming, we'd even have ancillary personnel starting to do some of the therapeutic work. We will overcome that, and I think that the concept of injection burden is far less important than the efficacy to our patients, and we'll figure it out. That I have no doubt. It's just a matter of, does it work well enough without complications? If we think we're helping our patients, we'll be able to do it.
Dr. Hopkins, you and I were talking about this before. Do you have any theories as to why patients with geographic atrophy get this exudation or choroidal neovascularization?
I don't think we know yet, Carolyn, is the short answer to a tough question, right? I mean, we know we have a multifactorial disease at play. We've gotten pretty good at dealing with the anti-VEGF therapies to control the choroidal neovascularization. Is this, some of the therapies for GA driving more of that in some way? Is it an inflammatory mechanism? I don't think we know. I think it is, it will be important, I think, in how we follow patients, image them, treat them, manage both aspects of the disease going forward. But I think it'll be really interesting to see as if these drugs come to market, we have more real world experience with them, how we see the patients faring and the physicians managing it.
Great. I want to change themes a little bit so I can ask Dr. Henry a question here, because you've been involved in a lot of planning of phase 3 clinical trials for geographic atrophy. And one thing that many people in companies and industry want to know is about clinical endpoints for geographic atrophy. It's not always so clear. We don't have the visual improvement endpoint that we used in neovascular AMD. So I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about development of clinical endpoints, and also a little bit about foveal involvement and non-foveal involvement. Do you think that is an important endpoint? And we can put it out to the panel too. How much is that going to play a role in your treatment of patients? But tell us a little bit about the endpoints first.
Sure, happy to. It's been really interesting to see the evolution of geographic atrophy studies. And we've learned from our past failures as well as from our recent successes. And I think it's a really exciting time. I think the imaging endpoints still remain the backstop, certainly for FDA registration enabling studies. We're still getting a handle on the best functional endpoint because there is still a strong desire to have functional support that complements the imaging endpoints. And I think we'll learn more as we see the readouts of the coming studies in the fall. But that I think remains an open question. In terms of within the imaging endpoint category, one thing that I think is playing an increasing role is the importance of patient subgroups. And we've seen most recently the delineation of whether or not the foveal center point is involved. So whether or not you call it extrafoveal, non-foveal, non-subfoveal, or non-center involved, essentially all of these subgroups are delineating whether or not the atrophy is involved in the center point of the fovea. And that tends to be an enrichment endpoint for if the foveal center point's not involved, the lesion moves more rapidly. We've seen both in the choice of enrolling just those patients or using that as a key subgroup, that tends to show a more robust progression over the 1 or 2 year trials, as well as opportunity for a treatment effect to be seen. And so I think that is one that has had a huge focus, and I would say in terms of how we think about future clinical evolution of that endpoint, having a standard definition of the image modality that we used for determining center point involvement is one thing that I think would really help. Perhaps all of us, deciding what's the best term to use would also be useful. And then I think there are other subgroups that are of interest that we still haven't quite fully understood, whether or not if foveal involvement or not is the only subgroup that is going to delineate the best rapidly progressing population and then treatment benefit, or if there may be others. We know from natural history studies that there are a number of other things that tend to show more or less rapid progression. So I'm looking forward to that, and certainly we have our own trial program, but I think that for the field at large, trying to figure out the right patient population that can be helpful for seeing treatment effects over 1 or 2 years, but also could be more generally applied to a broader population, so that we're not, again, limiting indications or labels.
Well, Dr. Boyer said earlier that he would maybe not treat patients with foveal involvement. Are you going to use foveal involvement to decide your treatment, or visual acuity, or whether they're monocular? How are you going to decide who you want to treat?
Did I say that?
Wait, you said maybe. You said maybe not if the fovea was involved, that they wouldn't be treated as aggressively. Let me change that.
Those are the patients that really want to be treated. They come to my office every day saying, when's this drug going to be available? I'm not saying I wouldn't treat them. I said, we have to see what the FDA labeling shows us.
Got it.
And I think these are patients, with small lesions. They really see a difference as that lesion grows, and they're anxious. Those are the ones that are knocking on your door every day saying, when's this drug going to be available? I'll take the shot. The ones that aren't knocking on your door are the ones that probably would benefit the most, and those are with the extrafoveal lesions. As you pointed out, what the definition is, we can argue. But those that are extrafoveal, you may give them years of better vision. I think that everybody in this room would like to treat earlier. I think that, we'd all like to be able to identify using OCT to see these dark areas that may, eventually lead to GA and treat those patients. But that's a longer study, and the FDA has got to buy into the fact that that is a precursor. But I think that, for the benefit of our patients, as was pointed out, we really want to treat as early as possible to prevent the GA from forming, prevent the visual loss. I think that's where I'm going. If it's approved, I will treat all patients that are under that label that want treatment.
All patients. Tarek, do you have anything that would suggest a more ideal candidate for this, frequent therapy if it comes to
I think,
fruition?
David makes a great point. I mean, obviously, we'd like to treat as early as possible because that's the best data we have available says that those are the folks that we may help the most long term. But the conundrum is, those are the people that we will not be able to show them anything to identify the fact that we're helping them. So they may not be truly the ideal candidate from a practical standpoint of you had asked earlier, how do we convince folks to do this? How do we convince folks to stay with it? I think initiating therapy is different than continuing therapy. It'll be easy to tell people, well, we have all this data and here's the thing, and then we show them 12 months later nothing from their perspective, and it's much harder to continue. I've been maybe a contrarian to some degree, but I think the people with foveal lesions are the best people to start with because they are more likely to grasp at anything to maintain what they have. And the best patients of those are the ones that have active wet AMD, because we all know how well anti-VEGF works to control their CNV, but why do they lose vision? They lose vision because their GA gets huge. And every one of us can show 10 patients a day to another patient and say, look what happened to these people. We controlled their lesion, but look at their GA grow exponentially over the course of just a few years. Those people you could actually get to start treating. Then we see how we do. We see how this drug is working over time. That's how it gets started in the marketplace. So although the best patients are the ones that David said, I don't know if they're going to be the easiest ones to get into extra treatment.
I think Tarek brings up a great point, reiterating what I said, the ones that we want to treat. The only way you're going to get a buy-in is to have AI show you what you have today, what you would have had if we didn't treat you. Because this is not a wowie drug. I mean, none of these drugs are wowie drugs like we had when we first gave our anti-VEGF. The doctor said wowie and the patient said wowie. They saw an improvement. They were not going to stop treatment. Here, this is like treating, glaucoma, where, you keep treating it, and the patient say, am I doing better? You say, yes, you're doing much better. And a lot of them drop out and don't take their medicine. So, Tarek's right. We need to have some form of imaging modality that we can show the patients, yes, you're doing much better than you would have if you didn't take this drug. This is keeping you from going into the fovea, or this is keeping that lesion from growing naturally.
Thank you again, Tarek. I think building onto all these great comments, sort of the endpoint discussion, I think is critical, and then the AI piece, right? I think we need to really, as a field, kind of come together and say, what do we need to understand about structure-function correlations here? In a natural history setting, in data, we have contrast sensitivity, we have vision, we have lesion growth, and then how can we build those AI tools to drive that forward? I mean, we should be at the intersection of a place right now where we could imagine visualizing that for a patient, how your lesion changes, what your vision does, what your contrast might do. That becomes really important for earlier treatment. It becomes really important for regulatory and payer and access for patients over time. And particularly as we look at potentially one-time therapies or committing someone to a long-term intravitreal, I think we've got to start building those assets for ourselves and our patients. And I think the time to start is now. I know we're on the cusp of many of them, but I think sort of coming together to drive that as a field it's kind of on all of us in this room to make that a reality.
I'm so happy you have that mic, because I have a question for you. We're just going to move on to something a little bit different now. For those of you, many of you probably don't know, but Dr. Hopkins and I were residents together just about 10 years ago. And
less than that, Carolyn.
I just want to ask, because now you are a senior vice president, global head at Novartis, you've had many different roles in big companies and small companies, but I want to know what sort of factors do you consider when you are designing or acquiring new therapeutics in your current role?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'll sort of pull on experiences from multiple roles through the decades. But I think a big one for me, and we heard it a lot from our speakers already today, is the unmet need. What is the problem you're trying to solve, and what are we trying to do for our patients? I think when you start there, that's always a great starting point. I've been really fortunate to work in industry and companies that's their sort of driving force, which has been great. And then I think the next piece is really, can you add to that unmet need transformative science, either in the form of delivery or in drug? And once you start to build that, and again, great question based on all the wonderful presentations this morning, but I think just thinking about, in a delivery platform, for example, is it a true platform? Can you see multiple, therapeutics that might be built into something like that? I think in the whole mechanism of action and transformative science, it's really about the coherence of the package, right? And again, when you can build, a strong MOA, a good reason to believe scientifically, when you have structure and function that start to add up, particularly compelling are biomarkers. I know David just presented that from ONL, and Gyroscope has some lovely biomarker work as well on, you actually can have evidence in the vitreous or aqueous of what is happening, no better target engagement, and again, making that very coherent package is really important. And then I think nowadays we have to think even more about how will that differentiate? What are the endpoints going to be? Will we get access? Can we have the capacity in clinic to deliver it effectively? Will we get it to patients around the globe? What is that pathway going to look like? And the payer piece, very important, right? So there may be payer endpoints that differ from the regulatory ones and will be just as important if we're thinking about actually delivering to patients. So it's a long answer, but step by step. And I think early engagement, meetings like these, hearing how people are putting their plans together, thinking through it is exceptionally helpful for the field.
Well, thank you so much, Jill. That's a great answer. I just want to, while we wrap it up here, I just want to go through the panel one by one. We heard about some of the complement therapeutics, and we heard about a surgical therapeutic for geographic atrophy. But going through, we'll start off with Jill, because you have the mic that works. What are some other therapeutics for geographic atrophy or delivery or imaging that you're looking forward to coming up in the future?
Yeah, as I said, I would love to see us crack the code on the AI progression conversation piece, because I think, again, we're getting a whole set of tools in the toolbox, hopefully, for this, very hard to treat geographic atrophy. If we have something that helps patients and us have a really robust conversation about what will be best for them, that would make me happy.
Yeah, I think that's a great answer. I think, we are indeed trying to crack the code from all sides. So it's great to see that we have companies that are getting close to having something in our hands to use in the clinic, and one aspect of the complement cascade, and obviously its effect on inflammation. But I also like seeing that we're working at different ends of this spectrum. I think that ultimately, since a lot of people don't seem to respond to any modification of the complement system, for GA, for example, that we got to get a little bit further downstream or further upstream. And I think whether it looks to me like the membrane attack complex and the inflammasome sort of does the work at the end of the train. So maybe that's what we have to attend to. And I think some of the new immunotherapies that are coming out, we've seen it in cancer. We've seen some remarkable things in immune modulation in cancer. And I think that ultimately getting there with geographic atrophy may give us that last bit that explains why we get the results that we get from the current methods of inhibiting complement. But we got to get down to where the business is actually happening, the dirty business of destroying the cells. And I think that's the membrane attack complex and the inflammasome.
Dr. Boyer?
No, I totally agree with Tarek. I think CD59, Humira's company, to limit that. It's a gene therapy, so it's that you don't require the monthly injections. But I also agree that I think we have to find what the stimulus or reduce the stimulus that causes the activation of the complex, whether it be macrophages or inflammasomes or whatever. I think we have to go further up and try to identify, is it amyloid that starts it? There are all these different ways that we can look at this, but if we stop the complement cascade from starting the alternative pathway, then hopefully we get better results.
Well, as you know, I'm a fan of the complement inhibitors, but outside of complement inhibition, when you look at these patients genetically, the other thing that you see more than anything else is H3A1 and ARMS2. That is those risk haplotypes are so associated with AMD generally and GA specifically. And so, we don't know a lot about what it's doing, whether or not inhibiting it or upregulating it is important, but I think that's another piece of the puzzle that I'm really looking forward to having a greater understanding of.
Well, thank you, everyone. I want to thank our panel for being so involved in this research and the companies that drive all of our innovation in geographic atrophy, and I hope that we have a treatment on the horizon and a way to treat this unmet need. Thank you so much.